I want to tell you about something that might hit close to home for many of you. There's this pattern I've seen countless times in my work, and it starts with a seemingly innocent label that gets placed on children early in their lives. You know the one I'm talking about, that word that sounds like a compliment, that word that makes parents beam with pride, that word that seems like it should open doors and make life easier. Here's what nobody tells you about being identified as intellectually advanced when you're young. It often becomes the very thing that sets you up for a lifetime of struggle with perfectionism, burnout, and a crushing sense of never being good enough. Let me paint you a picture of how this typically unfolds. Imagine a child sitting in a classroom, maybe around 6 or 7 years old. The work comes easily to them. Finish their assignments while other kids are still struggling with the first few problems. Teachers notice. Parents notice. And then something happens that seems positive on the surface, but carries hidden consequences. The adults start using certain phrases. They talk about how bright this child is, how much potential they have, how they could be the top student if they just tried a little harder. Sound familiar? Here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean where the foundation for future problems gets laid. When you're that kid who finds everything easy in those early years, you're actually missing out on something crucial. You're skipping over a developmental stage that your peers are going through. See? Education isn't just about learning facts and figures. It's not just about memorizing multiplication tables or understanding photosynthesis. There's a hidden curriculum that's arguably more important than anything in the textbooks. And that's the curriculum of learning how to learn. Think about it this way. For most children, there's a natural progression. In the early grades, maybe everything comes easily. But then around 2nd or 3rd grade, they hit their first real challenge. They have to study for a test. They have to review their notes the night before. It's uncomfortable at first, but they develop that habit. Then, as they progress through school, the difficulty gradually increases and their study skills gradually build to match. By 4th grade, they're studying a few days before a test. By middle school, they've got homework routines. By high school, they know how to manage their time across multiple subjects. And by the time they reach university or professional training, they've spent years building up this muscle, this capacity to sit down and do hard intellectual work, even when it doesn't come naturally. What happens to the child who doesn't need any of that? What happens to the kid who can ace tests without studying, who can finish assignments without effort, who cruises through year after year without ever having to develop those habits? Operating on raw ability alone. And for a while, that works. It works great, actually, until suddenly, catastrophically, it doesn't. There comes a moment, and it's different for everyone, when raw intelligence stops being enough. For some kids, it happens in middle school. Others, it's high school. For some, they make it all the way to university before they hit the wall. But hit it they do. And when they do, it's devastating because they've spent their entire academic life up to that point succeeding without really trying. And now they're in a situation where trying isn't optional anymore, but they have no idea how to try. They never learned. They never needed to. And now they're expected to perform at an even higher level, but they're starting from scratch in terms of actual work habits. Peers have been building those skills for years. I remember my own experience with this vividly. Throughout elementary school, I'd show up, do the work, get good grades, and barely break a sweat. Parent. Teacher conferences had a predictable rhythm. Every single teacher would say essentially the same thing to my parents. They'd say I was capable, that I was intelligent, that I had so much potential, and then would come the phrase that I heard over and over, if I just applied myself, I could be the best in the class. That phrase, applied myself, it haunted me. Because I wasn't applying myself. I didn't need to. I was getting decent grades without effort. So why would I put in extra work? But here's what was really happening beneath the surface. Every time an adult told me I had potential, every time they talked about what I could achieve, if I only tried harder, they were building an image in my mind. An image of who I should be, what I should be capable of, where I should end up. Image kept getting bigger and grander and more impressive. But nobody, not one single adult in my life, to consider that building something grand actually requires more work, not less. This is where I want to introduce an analogy that really helped me understand this dynamic, and I hope it helps you too. Think about two different construction projects. On one hand, you've got someone building a small cabin. Simple, functional, can be thrown together in a few weeks with basic materials. On the other hand, you've got someone planning to build a mansion. Multiple floors, intricate architecture, the works. Now, both projects start with a blueprint and a plot of land. And here's the trap that everyone falls into when people look at that mansion blueprint. They see all that potential. They see what an incredible building it could be. They get excited about all the rooms, all the features, all the possibilities. But they forget something absolutely fundamental. That mansion is going to take exponentially more time, more resources, more skill, more sustained effort than the cabin. This is exactly what happens with children who are labeled as having high intellectual potential. Everyone looks at them and sees the mansion. They see all that this child could become, all they could achieve. And in their minds, they make a critical error. They assume that because this child has more potential, things will be easier for them. That somehow having a grand blueprint means the construction will go faster. But the reality is precisely the opposite. Living up to significant potential requires more effort, more dedication, more sustained work than settling for something more modest. Let me make this concrete. Imagine two students both working hard for a month. One is building toward a modest goal, getting a decent job, a stable life, nothing spectacular, but nothing to be ashamed of either. The other is building toward something grand because that's what everyone has always told them they're capable of. They're supposed to get into a top university, land an impressive career, change the world somehow. Both students work equally hard for that month. But here's what happens. The first student makes visible progress toward their goal. They can see the results of their work. The cabin is taking shape. The second student, working just as hard, looks at what they've accomplished and sees almost nothing. They've barely laid the foundation of the mansion. They look over at their peer who now has a functional cabin, and they're confused and frustrated. Why am I so far behind? Why don't I even have something to show for all this work? Everyone always told me I was supposed to be better than this. And this is where the real psychological damage starts to set in, because society has set up this bizarre expectation that people with potential should have to work less, not more, to achieve their goals. That intelligence somehow means everything should be easier. But when you're aiming for something truly significant, you're trying to build that mansion, you need more than what others need. You need more materials, more time, more effort. And yet, you're constantly comparing yourself to people building cabins and wondering why they're finishing when you're not. I watched this play out with my own academic trajectory. When I got to high school, my middle school grades weren't quite at the level for advanced placement classes. The school said I should be in regular English, not honors. And my parents, bless them, they went to bat for me. They met with the teacher. They made their case. Their son is intelligent. He belongs in that advanced class. He just needs to apply himself. And the teacher, probably tired of dealing with pushy parents, agreed to let me in. But here's the thing, I really didn't belong there. Not because I wasn't intellectually capable, because I didn't have the work ethic, the study habits, the discipline that the class required. I'd been skating by on natural ability for so long that I had no idea how to actually buckle down and do sustained academic work. This pattern continued. I ended up taking 5 years to finish my undergraduate degree. 5 years. I graduated with a grade point average that was barely above 2.5. Then it took me another 3 or 4 years just to get accepted into medical school. And even then, I had to apply to over 100 schools before getting a single acceptance. This is not the trajectory that people imagine when they're looking at a bright-eyed child and talking about all their potential. Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't a story about failure. It's a story about what happens when we set up unrealistic expectations based on a flawed understanding of how potential actually works. When I finally made it to medical school, I had classmates who were 4 years younger than me. By the time I started my specialized training, some of the people evaluating my performance were actually younger than me, despite being further along in their careers. That could have been crushing to my ego. And for a long time it was. But eventually, I learned something valuable. I learned that I was taking what I call the scenic route through life. My path was longer, more winding, but it was my path. It wasn't wrong, it was just different. Let me talk about another dimension of this problem, and it's perhaps the most insidious one. It has to do with identity and shame. When you spend your entire childhood being told that your defining characteristic is your intelligence, that becomes your identity. You're the smart kid. That's who you are. That's what people value about you. That's your worth in the eyes of the world. And then something happens. Maybe you get to university and you're not the smartest person in the room anymore. Maybe you fail a class. You don't get into your dream school. Maybe you end up at a community college instead of a prestigious institution. And suddenly, thing that defined you, the one thing that made you special is being called into question. This creates a gap. A painful, shame-filled gap between who you thought you were supposed to be and who you actually are, between what everyone expected of you and what you've actually achieved. And the bigger that gap is, the more shame fills it. That shame becomes paralyzing. It makes it hard to take action, hard to move forward, hard to even try. Because if you're the smart kid possibly go to community college. In your mind, that's where people who aren't smart go. If you go there, you're admitting that you're not actually smart. You're admitting that everything you've built your identity on was false. You're losing the one thing about yourself that people have always valued. So instead of taking a pragmatic step forward, you freeze. You avoid. You procrastinate. You make excuses, because actually confronting the gap between expectation and reality is too painful. The shame is too overwhelming. And all the while, that shame is feeding on itself, growing larger, making the situation worse. You start to internalize messages about being a failure, about wasting your potential, about letting everyone down. And the ironic thing is that the very people who praised your potential all those years are often the ones whose disappointment cuts the deepest. Now, there's another factor we need to consider, and it relates to how comparison poisons everything for people who've been labeled as having exceptional abilities. See, the very concept of being intellectually advanced only exists in relation to other people. You can't be advanced in a vacuum. The term only has meaning when you're comparing yourself to others. And so from the very beginning, from the moment that label gets applied, you're trapped in a comparative framework. You're constantly measuring yourself against others. Am I doing better than them? Am I living up to being smarter than them? Why can they do this when I can't? This comparative mindset becomes deeply ingrained. It affects everything. You look at your older siblings' achievements and feel like you have big shoes to fill. You look at your classmates and wonder why they seem to be succeeding when you're struggling. You look at people in careers you don't find impressive and think you should be doing better than them because you were always told you were smarter. But here's the brutal truth that nobody tells you your life, your happiness, your success. None of that can be based on comparison to others because you're not them. You don't have their circumstances, their brain chemistry, their interests, their goals, their values. What makes someone else happy might make you miserable. What someone else finds easy might be hard for you, and vice versa. The first step in breaking free from this trap is recognizing that comparison has to stop. And I mean really stop, not just intellectually acknowledge it, while still constantly measuring yourself against others in your head. You have to let go of the entire framework. You have to stop judging yourself based on what others have achieved or where they are in life. You have to start from a place of radical acceptance of who you actually are, not who you think you should be. This is incredibly hard. It requires letting go of the identity you've held for your entire life. It requires admitting that maybe you're not going to be the most successful person you know. Maybe you're not going to change the world. Maybe you're going to have a perfectly ordinary life, and that has to be okay. Because here's the secret that nobody tells you: an ordinary life, authentically, with acceptance of who you actually are, is infinitely more satisfying than an extraordinary life that you're constantly failing to live up to. The second thing you need to accept is that if you truly are aiming for something significant, the road is going to be long. Really long. Longer than you think, longer than seems fair. And progress is going to be slow. Painfully slow. You're going to put in months or years of work and feel like you have nothing to show for it. You're going to watch other people achieve their more modest goals while you're still laying groundwork. And you have to make peace with that. You have to understand that the mansion takes longer to build than the cabin. That's not a flaw in you. That's not you being slow or lazy or not living up to your potential. That's just how building something significant works. I can tell you from my own experience, there were years where I felt like I was spinning my wheels, years where I was putting in effort, but couldn't see any results. My peers were becoming established doctors while I was still trying to get into medical school. People I'd gone to high school with were building careers and families while I was still trying to figure out my academic path. And it would have been so easy to give up, to decide that I was a failure, that I'd wasted my potential. But I kept going. One step at a time, one small goal at a time, not comparing myself to anyone else, just focusing on the next thing in front of me. And eventually, things started to come together. I got into medical school. I worked hard there, really applied myself for the first time in my life, and I did well. I did an audition rotation at a prestigious hospital competing with people younger than me, and I succeeded. I ended up training at one of the top institutions in my field. And now I teach there, but none of that would have happened if I'd given up when things looked hopeless. None of it would have happened if I'd let shame and comparison paralyze me. Now, let's talk about what to do if you're stuck in that shame gap I mentioned earlier. That gap between expectations and achievement, all the painful feelings live. There are really only two ways to close that gap. The first is to actually achieve what you expected, to get the grades, get into the school, get the job, build the life that you thought you were supposed to have. And that's great if you can do it. But it's not always possible. And it's not always what you actually want when you really examine it honestly. The second way to close the gap, and this is the one that's often more accessible and more powerful, is to let go of the expectations down to meet reality. I know how that sounds. It sounds like giving up. It sounds like settling. It sounds like admitting defeat. But it's not. It's actually the most liberating thing you can do. Because when you release those expectations, when you accept yourself exactly as you are right now, something magical happens. The shame disappears. And when the shame disappears, you suddenly have access to your actual capabilities. See, shame is incredibly draining. It takes up mental and emotional energy. It creates avoidance and procrastination. It makes everything harder. When you're operating from a place of shame, trying to prove yourself, trying to live up to expectations, trying to be someone you're not, you're fighting yourself every step of the way. When you accept yourself as you are, when you let go of all those shoulds and supposed, you free up all that energy. You can actually see clearly what you want, what you're capable of, what steps you need to take. And ironically, you often end up achieving more than you would have while trapped in shame and comparison. I want to give you a practical exercise for learning to let go of expectations, because I know this all sounds very abstract and philosophical. Here's something you can try. For the next month or two, whenever you go to a restaurant, don't order what you want. Just tell the server to surprise you, or ask them what they recommend and order that without questioning it. Just accept whatever comes. Now you're thinking, what if I don't like it? What if it's terrible? What if I'm hungry and I end up with food I can't eat? And yes, all of those things might happen. That's the point. The exercise isn't about getting a good meal. It's about practicing being okay when reality doesn't match your expectations. It's about learning to accept what is rather than what you wished for. Pay attention to what happens when you do this. Notice how much of your restaurant experience is usually about expectations. You expect the food to taste a certain way. You expect to enjoy your meal. You expect to get good value for your money. And when those expectations aren't met, you're disappointed, sometimes disproportionately so. But when you go in without expectations, when you just accept whatever arrives, something shifts. If the food is bad, it's not as devastating because you weren't expecting it to be good. If the food is great, it's a wonderful surprise. You end up enjoying the experience more, regardless of the objective quality of the meal. This is what acceptance does. It doesn't mean you stop wanting things or trying to achieve things. It means you stop making your happiness contingent on specific outcomes. You stop creating that gap between expectation and reality where shame lives. You start meeting life where it actually is rather than where you think it should be. Now, let me address something from a different angle. There are parents and teachers and managers listening to this and wondering what they should do differently. How do we support people with high potential without setting them up for this trap? It starts with understanding that having significant intellectual capabilities is actually a special educational need. That sounds counterintuitive. I know. We think of special needs as something for people who are struggling, not people who are excelling. The needs of someone with high intellectual capacity are genuinely different from average. And when those needs aren't met, they struggle just as much as anyone else with unmet needs. One of the biggest mistakes we make is thinking that when someone with potential is struggling, they need things to be easier. We slow down, reduce expectations. We give them more time or fewer assignments. But that's often exactly the opposite of what they need. Usually need is more challenge, not less. They need to be pushed, engaged, given something that actually requires them to stretch. Seen this play out in my clinical work. Parents come in because their teenager is struggling in school and spending all their time on video games. And when we dig into it, pattern becomes clear. School is boring. It moves at the pace of the slowest student in the class. There's no challenge, no engagement, nothing that matches this kid's actual capability. But video games are brilliant at matching challenge to ability. When you beat one level, you immediately move to the next. If you get stuck, you stay there until you improve. The difficulty scales perfectly with your skill. That's incredibly satisfying to the human brain, especially to a brain that's been starved of appropriate challenge. So what do? We find them a real challenge. We connect them with internships, with mentors, with projects that are actually hard. Once placed a teenager who was failing school and gaming constantly into a startup working on medical technology. He had to start by doing basic tasks, making coffee, learning the business. But the people there recognized his potential and started giving him real responsibilities. Before long, he was teaching himself database management because the company needed it. He stopped gaming because he had something genuinely challenging and meaningful to work on. This is what supporting someone with high potential actually looks like. It's not about making things easier. It's not about lowering expectations or reducing pressure. It's about providing appropriate challenge and having faith that they can handle it. It's about saying, I believe you can do this difficult thing, and then supporting them while they try without being devastated if they fail. There's a subtle but important distinction here between expectations and faith. Expectations are about you and what you want from someone. Faith is about them and what they're capable of. When you have expectations, you're disappointed when they're not met. When you have faith, you're supportive regardless of outcome. That's the attitude we need to take with people who have significant potential, not demanding that they achieve great things, but believing they can and supporting them in trying. I also want to address the structural issues with how we educate people with advanced capabilities. The traditional educational system is set up for the average student, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it means that students at the extremes, both those who struggle and those who excel, often don't get what they need. When I was in elementary school, I remember finishing assignments quickly and asking for more work. The teacher didn't have more work to give me. The system wasn't designed for students who worked faster than average. So I'd sit there, bored, learning nothing except that school was something to be endured rather than engaged with. This happens all the time. Students who could handle accelerated material are kept at the pace of the class. They learn that effort isn't necessary and that learning is boring. Then years later, we wonder why they're struggling and unmotivated. We set them up for that. We taught them that showing up is enough, that they don't need to push themselves, that learning isn't about being challenged. Some schools handle this better than others. Gifted programs that actually provide appropriate challenge. Some allow acceleration or provide enrichment. But many don't, either due to resource constraints or philosophical opposition to treating students differently. And so we end up with a generation of people who were identified as having potential, but never given the support they needed to develop it properly. If you're someone in education, whether as a teacher or administrator, encourage you to think carefully about how you're serving students at all levels of ability. Are you providing appropriate challenge? Are you allowing students to move at their own pace? Are you teaching work, habits explicitly, not just assuming students will pick them up? Are you helping students develop their identity around more than just their intellectual abilities? These questions matter because the way we handle someone's early education shapes their entire life trajectory. A student who learns good work habits early has a huge advantage. A student who develops a healthy relationship with challenge and failure can keep growing. A student who builds an identity around multiple strengths rather than just intelligence alone has more resilience when things get hard. Let me circle back to something I mentioned earlier about comparison, because I think it's worth diving deeper into. The entire concept of being intellectually advanced is comparative by definition. You can't be advanced without others being behind. This sets up a relational framework from the very beginning. And humans are naturally comparative creatures anyway. We're always looking at what others have, what they've achieved, how we measure up. But when you've been explicitly labeled as better than others in a particular dimension, that comparison becomes turbocharged. It becomes part of your identity. The problem is that comparison is a fundamentally flawed way to understand yourself or your life, because you're comparing your internal experience to everyone else's external presentation. You know all your doubts, fears, struggles, and failures intimately. You live with them every day. But with everyone else, you only see the surface. You see their accomplishments, their apparent confidence, their public successes. You're comparing your messy, complicated reality to everyone else's highlight reel. And you're always going to come up short in that comparison. Even if you somehow manage to be objectively more accomplished than everyone around you, comparison doesn't lead to satisfaction. There's always someone doing better. There's always a higher level to reach. There's always more you could be doing. Comparison creates a treadmill that never stops a race that has no finish line. The only way to win is not to play, but how do you stop playing when you've been playing your entire life? When comparison is woven into the very fabric of how you understand yourself, it's hard. It requires conscious, sustained effort, requires catching yourself every time your brain starts that comparative loop. It requires redirecting your attention back to yourself, own values, your own goals, your own experience. One thing that helps is building an identity that's not based on being better than others. Finding things that are meaningful to you independent of how you compare. Maybe that's creative expression. Maybe it's helping others. Maybe it's mastering a skill for its own sake. Not to be the best, but just because you enjoy it. When you have sources of meaning and satisfaction that aren't comparative, you become less dependent on comparison for your sense of self-worth. Another thing that helps is practicing gratitude for what you actually have, rather than focusing on what you don't have or what others have that you want. This sounds trite, I know. Gratitude has become such a buzzword that it's easy to dismiss. There's real psychological value in actively appreciating your actual circumstances rather than constantly focusing on the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. I also want to talk about the role of failure in all of this because it's central to the experience of people who were identified as advanced when young. Many of them have very little experience with actual failure early in life. Things come easily. They succeed without trying. They don't learn how to cope with setbacks because they don't experience many setbacks. Then, when they eventually do fail, which everyone does eventually, they have no framework for handling it. They have no resilience built up. They've constructed an identity around being smart and capable, and failure threatens that identity at its core. This is where I see people really struggle. They hit a failure, a rejection, a setback, and it's devastating, not because of the practical consequences, but because of what it means about them. If I failed, I must not be smart. If I'm not smart, who am I? What value do I have? Their entire sense of self comes crashing down. And because they have no experience with failure, they don't know that it's possible to fail and be okay, to fail and still have worth, fail and learn and grow and try again. Building resilience requires experiencing failure in manageable doses. It requires learning that failure is information, not identity. It requires developing the capacity to sit with uncomfortable feelings without being destroyed by them. People who've spent their lives avoiding failure or never encountering it, this is genuinely difficult, but it's necessary for any kind of meaningful growth One of the things I learned through my own long and winding path is that failure isn't the opposite of success, is part of the process of success. Every time I got rejected from a medical school, I learned something. I improved my application. I worked on my weaknesses. I became more realistic about what I needed to do. Those rejections weren't fun. They were painful and discouraging. They were necessary. They forced me to develop resilience and determination that I wouldn't have needed if everything had come easily. Now I work with people who are struggling with exactly these issues, and one of the most powerful things I can do is simply normalize their experience. Know that see you struggling doesn't mean they're defective or that they've wasted their potential. Taking longer than others doesn't mean they're failing. That having a complicated relationship with their abilities is actually incredibly common and not something to be ashamed of. Hearing that can be profoundly relieving because most people who go through this think they're alone. They think they're the only one who was supposed to be successful, but isn't. They think everyone else has it figured out. But the truth is that this experience is remarkably common, especially among people who were labeled as advanced when young. There's also something important to understand about motivation. Many people who struggle with perfectionism and burnout think their problem is lack of motivation. They think if they could just get motivated, they'd be able to achieve what they're supposed to achieve. But the problem usually isn't lack of motivation. Their motivation is being completely consumed by shame and avoidance. When you're trapped in that gap between who you think you should be and who you are, when you're constantly comparing yourself to others and finding yourself lacking, when you're carrying around the weight of disappointed expectations, you don't have mental and emotional energy left over for actual motivated action. The shame is draining all your resources. This is why acceptance is so powerful. When you let go of the expectations, when you stop comparing, when you accept yourself as you are, all that energy that was going into shame and avoidance becomes available for other things. Suddenly, you can think clearly about what you actually want. You can take action without it being contaminated by proving something or living up to something. You can fail without it destroying you. Your motivation returns, but it's a different kind of motivation. It's not desperate or shame-driven. It's coming from a place of genuine interest and care rather than fear and inadequacy. I want to emphasize that none of this means you shouldn't aim high or try to achieve difficult things. This isn't about lowering your standards or settling for mediocrity. It's about building a healthy relationship with ambition where your goals come from your actual values and interests rather than from external expectations or comparison. It's about pursuing things because they matter to you, not because they'll prove something about you or make you better than someone else. When you operate from that place, achievement becomes possible in a way it never was when you were trapped in shame and comparison. Because you're not fighting yourself anymore. You're not carrying around the weight of disappointed expectations. You're just moving toward things that matter to you, learning and growing along the way, accepting that progress is often slow and non-linear. That's okay. That's how real growth actually works. So if you recognize yourself in what I've been describing, if you spent your childhood being told about your potential and now you're struggling with perfectionism and burnout And shame, I want you to know that you're not broken. You're not a failure. You haven't wasted anything. You're simply dealing with the consequences of a system that doesn't serve people like you very well. Now you're learning to navigate it in a healthier way. That takes time. It takes patience with yourself. It takes willingness to let go of ideas about who you should be and embrace who you actually are. But it's possible. Seen it countless times. I've lived it myself. And on the other side of that process is something much better than living up to your potential. It's living as yourself, genuinely and without shame, building a life that actually fits you rather than trying to squeeze yourself into someone else's idea of what you should be. And that's worth every bit of effort it takes to get there.